Chain me again, and I won't need fire." The words didn't rise above a whisper, but they carried farther than the laughter that followed, slipping through the dry morning air of Dry Creek like something the wind refused to bury. And for a moment, just a moment, one or two men at the edge of the crowd felt it, that quiet weight behind the voice, before the sound of boots scraping dirt and palms slapping denim drowned it out again, because men like to laugh when they don't understand. And Dry Creek had built itself on not understanding anything it didn't want to see, especially not a lone Apache standing chained to a charred post in the middle of town square, the blackened wood still smelling faintly of last night's fire, smoke clinging low to the ground like it hadn't finished telling its story yet. And Takoda stood there with his wrists bound in iron, shoulders steady, eyes lifted just enough to meet no one and everyone at once, his silence sharper than anything they were saying about him. Words like arsonist and trouble, tossed around like loose change, easy, careless, unexamined, while Sheriff Haver leaned one boot against the post and checked the chain with a tug that seemed more for show than necessity, nodding once like he'd just proven something to himself, something simple and convenient. And behind him the townsfolk gathered in loose half-circles, hats low, arms crossed, the kind of posture that says judgment's already been passed, and there's no need to rush the ending. Not when you're certain how it's supposed to go. But certainty has a sound when it cracks, and that sound was quieter than laughter, quieter than the shifting dust under boots, quieter even than the creak of leather in the heat. It lived in the details no one bothered to look at, like the burns on Takoda's hands, not fresh and wild but deep and patterned, as if they'd been earned in place, held steady against something hotter than fear. Something that didn't leave room for hesitation, and Elias Carter saw that, standing just outside the circle where judgment turned into spectacle, his hat pulled low but not enough to hide the way his gaze stayed fixed, not on the chain, not on the sheriff, but on those hands, and then on the thin strip of leather resting against Takoda's chest, darkened at the edges, curled inward where heat had kissed it too long, tied there with a simple cord like it mattered more than anything else he could have kept. And Elias felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with sympathy and everything to do with recognition, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just settles in and refuses to leave, while somewhere beyond the last row of buildings, beyond the hitching posts and the dry well and the narrow road leading out toward the hills, a faint line of gray still lingered against the sky. A reminder that the fire hadn't been a story told overnight. It had been real, close enough for the wind to carry its breath into town, close enough for anyone awake to have seen it, to have heard it, and still no one had asked the question that mattered, because asking would mean doubting, and doubting would mean admitting they might be wrong. And Dry Creek didn't like being wrong. It liked things simple, liked its lines clean and its blame easy. So when Elias finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tail end of a laugh that didn't quite land the way it was supposed to, the words felt heavier than they should have been for how few there were who saw him start it. And for the first time since the chain had closed around Takoda's wrists, the rhythm of the square shifted, just slightly, just enough for a few heads to turn, and a few smiles to pause before deciding whether to return, because silence, even a small one, has a way of asking questions no one's ready to answer. The question did not echo loudly, but it did not disappear either. It lingered in the space between breaths, in the slight shift of boots against dirt, in the way Sheriff Haver's hand paused on the chain before giving it another casual pull, and for a second his eyes flickered toward Elias Carter with something that was not quite anger and not quite concern, just a thin line of discomfort that passed as quickly as it came, because a man in his position could not afford hesitation, not in front of a town that depended on him to make things simple, to draw lines where none naturally existed. And so he straightened, adjusted his hat, and answered in a voice loud enough to restore order. "We do not need witnesses for what everyone already knows." And the crowd responded the way crowds do, with nods and murmurs that sounded like agreement, even if no one could have repeated a single detail of what they believed, because belief here was not built on memory. It was built on convenience, on the need to have a reason for the smoke that had rolled down from the hills before sunrise, for the fear that had crept into their homes while they slept, for the uneasy feeling that something had happened beyond their control. And Takoda stood at the center of all that unspoken fear like a shape they could point to, a name they could attach to the unknown. and that made him useful in a way truth never was. But Elias did not look at the sheriff when he answered. He kept his eyes on the man in chains, on the quiet way Dakota breathed, steady and measured, as if the noise around him belonged to another world entirely. And then Elias spoke again, softer this time, not to the crowd but into the space between himself and Dakota. You were near the ridge last night. And it was not a question, not exactly, more like a piece of something half-remembered, because Elias had been awake when the sky turned that strange color, had stepped outside his cabin miles from town and seen the glow against the horizon, had smelled the same smoke that still clung to the air now. And for a moment he thought he had seen movement out there, a figure against the light, but distance and darkness had blurred it into uncertainty, something easy to dismiss until now. Until he stood here and saw the burns on Dakota's hands, the kind that came from holding on to something longer than sense would allow. And Dakota's eyes shifted then, just slightly, meeting Elias's for the first time with a look that carried no accusation, no plea, just recognition, as if he understood exactly what Elias was reaching for and knew it would not be enough. Not yet. And the strip of leather at his chest moved with his breath, catching the light in a way that made its edges clearer, the stitching small and uneven, done by someone with careful hands but not much time. And from somewhere in the crowd a voice broke in, sharp and impatient. He was seen near the hills, that is enough. And others picked it up, repeating it, reshaping it, until it sounded like fact, until it sounded like something that had always been known. And Sheriff Haver nodded again, grateful for the momentum returning to his side, because momentum was easier than proof, easier than questions, easier than looking too closely at anything that might unravel the story they had already decided to tell. And yet the air did not fully settle back into certainty. Something remained off balance, like a scale that refused to tip all the way, and it showed in the smaller details. In the way a woman near the front kept glancing at the leather strip and then away. In the way a young boy clutched his father's sleeve and whispered something that went unheard. In the way the wind shifted again, carrying a faint scent that was not just smoke, but something softer beneath it, like fabric that had been too close to flame but not consumed. And Elias felt that same pressure building behind his ribs, that sense that the truth was close enough to touch if he reached in the right direction. But every direction he tried seemed to meet resistance, not from Dakota, who remained still and quiet, but from the town itself, from the weight of its certainty pressing down on anything that threatened to disturb it. And still, in the center of it all, Dakota did not look like a man waiting for mercy. He looked like a man waiting for something else entirely, something that had not arrived yet, but was coming all the same. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, like ice under too many footsteps, subtle at first, almost polite, and then it spread, carried by the same wind that refused to let the smell of smoke leave the square, and Elias felt it before he saw it. That quiet shift where certainty begins to loosen its grip, not enough to fall apart, but enough to make men glance sideways instead of straight ahead. And Dakota stood unchanged at the center of it, his breathing steady, his shoulders neither tense nor relaxed, as if he had already stepped beyond whatever judgment this town thought it could pass. And then, without raising his voice, he spoke again, not to the sheriff, not to the crowd, but into the space that had opened. The fire started where the ground dips near the cedar line, and the words did not sound like defense. They sounded like memory, precise and unhurried. And a few heads turned toward the hills, as if the land itself might confirm or deny what he said, because everyone in Dry Creek knew that dip, knew how dry it had been this season, how the wind cut through it stronger than anywhere else. And Sheriff Haver's jaw tightened just enough to be noticed by the man standing closest to him. A flicker of something calculating passing behind his eyes before he answered. Convenient story, but the word convenient did not carry the same weight it had a moment ago. It landed softer, uncertain, because now there was detail where before there had only been assumption, and detail has a way of asking for more. And Elias took a step closer, boots pressing into the dust that had not yet settled since morning, his voice low but clear. What were you doing there? And this time it was a question, not an accusation, not a trap, just a straight line offered where the town had drawn circles. And Dakota looked at him again, longer now, as if measuring something that had nothing to do with words. And then his gaze shifted past Elias, past the sheriff, toward the far edge of the square where the buildings thinned and the road bent toward the wells. And for a moment it seemed like he might not answer at all, like whatever he was waiting for had not yet arrived. But then he lifted his chin slightly and said, "Listening." And the word fell into the space between them like a stone into still water, small, but impossible to ignore, because it did not fit the story they had built. It did not accuse, did not defend, it simply existed, and the crowd reacted the way people do when something does not fit, with confusion dressed up as dismissal, a few voices rising to laugh again. But the laughter came slower now, thinner, as if it had to push through something heavier to be heard. And from the edge of the gathering, the same woman who had gasped earlier took a step forward before she could stop herself, her eyes fixed on the strip of leather at Takota's chest, her hand trembling slightly as she spoke. Not loud, not meant for everyone, but loud enough that those closest heard it and turned. "That's stitching," she said, almost to herself. "I have seen that before." And the words moved through the crowd in ripples, curiosity slipping in where certainty had been. And Sheriff Haver shifted his stance, placing himself more firmly between Takota and the people, as if proximity could restore control. But control had already begun to slip, not in a dramatic way, not with raised voices or sudden movements, but in the quietest possible form, in questions that refused to stay buried, in details that refused to fade. And Elias felt it settle into place. That sense that whatever had happened in the hills had not followed the path this town had chosen for it, and that the man in chains was not the center of the story, only the point where all the lines crossed, and somewhere beyond the last building, just out of sight, a faint sound rose again, softer this time, but clearer, the sound of a child calling out, carried on the wind that still smelled of smoke, and something else beneath it, something that did not belong to destruction at all. The sound came again, clearer now, not carried by imagination but by air that refused to lie, a child's voice, thin but steady, calling from somewhere beyond the last row of buildings. And this time more heads turned, more bodies shifted, because sound like that does not belong in a place where judgment has already been decided. It belongs to something unfinished, something still moving. And the woman who had spoken about the stitching stepped forward again, slower now, as if each step required permission from the ground beneath her, her eyes never leaving the strip of leather resting against Takota's chest. And when she reached the edge of the inner circle, her voice came out stronger, not loud, but certain. "That is my work," she said. And the words did not echo. They settled, heavy and immediate. And Sheriff Haver turned sharply toward her, his expression tightening in a way that suggested he had not planned for interruption. "You should step back, Miss Laurel," he said. But she did not move, did not even look at him, because her attention had already narrowed to something far more important, to the uneven stitching she had made 3 nights ago by lantern light, to the small tear she had mended in a hurry while a child sat beside her, restless and impatient. And now that same piece of leather hung darkened by heat around the neck of a man they had called a criminal, and the space between assumption and truth narrowed further, pressing in on everyone who stood there. And Elias felt it as clearly as the dust beneath his boots, that tightening, that quiet insistence that the story they had accepted was beginning to unravel thread by thread. And Takota remained still, not stepping forward, not speaking again, simply allowing the weight of what was already present to settle into place, because sometimes silence does more than words ever could. And Miss Laurel took another step, close enough now to see the fine lines along Takota's hands, the marks left not by carelessness but by holding something through heat long enough to protect it. And her voice softened, not with fear, but with recognition. "Where did you find this?" she asked, and Takota's eyes shifted to her, not surprised, not guarded, just steady. And he answered in the same calm tone he had used before. "It was not found," he said. "It was carried." And the difference between those 2 words settled over the crowd like a change in weather, subtle but undeniable. Because carried implies intention, implies purpose, implies a choice made in a moment where other choices might have been easier. And the murmurs that followed were no longer unified, no longer certain. They broke apart into smaller questions, quieter doubts. And Sheriff Haver felt it slipping now, the clean line he had drawn blurring at the edges. So he stepped forward, raising his voice just enough to gather attention again. "This changes nothing," he said, but the words did not land the way they should have, because now there were too many eyes not on him, but on the man in chains, on the leather strip, on Miss Laurel's trembling hands as she reached out, stopping just short of touching it, as if afraid that doing so might confirm something she was not ready to say aloud. And from beyond the buildings the child's voice came once more, closer this time, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps on dry ground, and the crowd parted without being asked, instinctively making space for something they did not yet understand but could no longer ignore. And Elias turned toward the sound, his breath slowing as the final piece of something unseen began to move into place, because whatever had happened in the hills was not finished speaking, and it was about to arrive where everyone could see it. The child broke through the edge of the crowd like a gust of wind that no one had invited, but no one could stop, small boots kicking up dust, breath uneven but determined, and every voice in the square fell away not because anyone commanded it, but because something deeper than authority demanded it, and the boy ran straight past Sheriff Haver, past the men who had stood with crossed arms and certain minds, until he reached the space before the charred post, where Takota stood unmoving, and for a moment the child simply stopped, as if the world had narrowed to that single point, his eyes lifting, wide and searching, until they met Takota's. And in that instant the tension that had been stretched across the entire town seemed to loosen, just enough to be felt, and the boy stepped forward and reached out, not to the chain, not to the sheriff, but to the strip of leather resting against Takota's chest, his small fingers brushing the edge of it with a familiarity that no one could mistake, and his voice came out soft, but clear enough for those closest to hear. "You kept it," he said, and the words carried further than they should have, because silence had already made room for them. And Miss Laurel's hand flew to her mouth as she looked between the boy and the stitching she knew as her own, and Elias felt something settle into place with a certainty that did not need explanation, while the sheriff shifted again, his stance no longer firm but adjusting, searching for ground that no longer held steady beneath him. And the boy turned then, looking out at the crowd with the kind of confusion only a child could carry, not understanding why the man who had brought him back from the edge of something dark now stood bound in the center of judgment. And he spoke again, louder this time, not out of defiance, but out of simple truth. "He told me to hold on." And the words were plain, unadorned, but they struck deeper than any accusation, because they did not argue, they revealed, and a murmur moved through the town, not unified, not controlled, but scattered, uncertain, as if each person had begun to hear a different version of the same story forming in their mind. And Takota lowered his gaze slightly, not in shame, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if the moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived without needing his voice to call it forward. And Elias took a step closer, his eyes moving from the boy to the burned hands, to the leather strip, to the quiet man who had stood through it all without asking for anything. And he reached out, not quickly, not with force, but with intention, his fingers finding the cold metal of the chain where it met the post. And for a heartbeat no one moved, not the sheriff, not the crowd, not even the wind, as if the entire town held itself still to see what would happen next. And then Elias loosened the first link, not breaking it, not tearing it free, just easing the tension enough that it shifted with a dull sound against the wood. And that sound carried farther than any shout had that morning, because it was not loud, it was final, and Sheriff Haver opened his mouth as if to speak, but whatever words he had prepared did not come, because there was nothing left that could restore what had already begun to change. And the boy stepped closer still, placing his small hand against Takota's arm as if to steady him, though it was the town itself that had begun to lose its balance. And in that quiet, in that space where certainty had once stood unchallenged, something else took its place, something slower, heavier, and far more difficult to ignore. No one gave the order for silence, but it settled anyway, heavy and complete, pressing down on Dry Creek in a way no law ever had. And Elias kept his hand on the chain, feeling the cold iron loosen under his grip, not forced, not broken, just released enough to show that it could be. And that was all it took, because once something proves it can change, it already has, and Takota did not move when the tension eased. did not pull away, did not claim anything for himself. He simply stood there as he had from the beginning, steady and present, as if the moment belonged not to him but to the truth that had finally found its way into the open, and the boy stayed close at his side, his small hand still resting against Takota's arm, not afraid, not uncertain, just there, as if that was the most natural place in the world to stand. And Miss Laurel lowered her trembling hand at last, her eyes no longer searching but seeing, tracing every stitch she had sewn, every careful line that now told a story far different from the one spoken at dawn. And she stepped back slowly, not in retreat, but in recognition, as if giving space to something that no longer needed her voice to be real. And Sheriff Haver shifted his weight again. But there was nowhere left for him to stand that did not feel exposed, no position that could restore the certainty he had worn so easily before. And he looked out over the town, searching for agreement, for someone to meet his eyes and confirm that things were still as they had been. But the faces that looked back at him had changed, not dramatically, not with anger or accusation, but with something quieter and far more difficult to command, doubt. And doubt does not shout. It does not argue. It simply refuses to leave, and one by one, men who had laughed earlier lowered their gaze, adjusting their hats, shifting their stance, as if the ground beneath them had taken on a different shape. And Elias released another link, the metal giving with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been, because now every ear was listening, every breath measured against what came next, and still Takota said nothing, offered nothing beyond what had already been shown, because there was nothing left to prove. And the wind moved through the square again, lighter now, carrying away the last sharp edge of smoke and leaving behind something cleaner, something that did not cling or choke. And the boy looked up at Takota with a small, steady expression that held no fear, only trust, the kind that does not come from words but from what has already been done. And Elias stepped back just enough to let the chain fall loose. Against the post, no longer binding, no longer defining, just a piece of metal without purpose. And for a long moment no one moved to stop it. No one reached to restore what had been undone, because there was nothing left to hold it in place except the memory of what they had believed. And that memory was already beginning to fade under the weight of what they now knew. And Sheriff Haver lowered his hand from the chain without a word, his shoulders settling in a way that spoke not of defeat, but of something quieter, an understanding that authority does not survive where truth stands clear. And in that stillness, with no command given and no apology spoken, the town of Dry Creek shifted, not in noise, not in spectacle, but in the silent agreement of those who had finally seen. And Takota took one slow breath, lifting his head slightly toward the open sky beyond the buildings, as if acknowledging something unseen, something that had been waiting longer than any of them. And then he stepped forward, not away from the post, not toward the crowd, but simply forward, into a space that no longer held him back. He did not hurry, and that was the first thing they noticed, not the absence of chains, not the silence of the sheriff, but the way Takota moved forward without urgency, as if he had never been held at all, as if the moment had always belonged to him, and he had simply waited for the rest of them to catch up. And the boy walked beside him without being asked, matching his pace step for step, small boots pressing into the same dust that had once marked a line between them, and now held none. And Elias watched them both with a stillness that felt different from before, no longer searching, no longer questioning, just witnessing something that did not need his intervention anymore. And behind him the town remained quiet, not frozen, not afraid, just unsure of what came next when the story they had believed no longer held its shape. And Miss Laurel lowered her gaze for a moment, her fingers brushing against her apron where the memory of the stitching still lived. And when she looked up again there was no confusion left in her eyes, only a quiet understanding that settled deep and stayed there. And Sheriff Haver stepped back from the post without realizing he had moved, his boots finding space that had not been there a moment ago, as if the town itself had shifted to make room for what it could no longer deny. And he cleared his throat, not to command, not to declare, but simply because the silence had grown too heavy to ignore, yet no words followed, because there were none that could restore what had been undone without sounding hollow, and hollow words have a way of revealing more than they conceal. So he said nothing, and that silence, coming from the one man who had spoken the loudest before, carried further than any order ever had. And Takoda reached the edge of the square where the dirt road bent toward the open land. And he stopped there, not to turn back, not to wait, but to look out, as if measuring distance not in miles but in something else entirely, something that could not be marked on a map. And the wind moved again, softer. Now, lifting the edge of his shirt, brushing against the leather strip at his chest, and for a brief moment the light caught it just right, revealing the careful stitches, the small imperfections that made it real, made it human, made it impossible to dismiss. And the boy looked up at him with that same steady expression, not asking where they were going, not asking why, because trust does not need direction, it only needs presence. And Elias felt a quiet pull in his chest, something that told him this moment was not an ending, not even close, but a beginning that would not announce itself with noise or spectacle, just with the simple act of moving forward. And behind them, the people of Dry Creek began to shift, not all at once, not together, but individually, hats lowered, shoulders adjusting, steps taken without comment, as if each person had to find their own way out of the certainty they had stood in just minutes before. And no one called out, no one tried to stop what was happening, because there are moments when a town understands, without being told, that it has no right to interfere, and this was one of them. And Takoda took another step, then another, and the boy followed, and the distance between them and the square grew slowly, naturally, until the space they left behind felt larger than the space they entered. And Elias remained where he was, watching until they reached the bend in the road, until their figures softened against the light. And just before they disappeared from view, Takoda paused for the briefest second, not turning, not looking back, but simply standing there, as if acknowledging something unseen, something that had been resolved without needing words. And then he continued on, leaving behind a town that would not speak of this day loudly, would not celebrate or explain it, but would carry it quietly, in the way men carry truths they wish they had seen sooner. And in the silence that followed, Dry Creek did not feel the same as it had that morning, not because anything had been taken from it, but because something had been returned. The dust did not settle right away after they left. It lingered in the air as if the ground itself was unsure whether to return to what it had been or accept what it had just witnessed. And Elias remained standing at the edge of the square longer than he intended, his eyes fixed on the bend in the road where Takoda and the boy had disappeared, not expecting them to return, not hoping, just holding onto the last clear image before distance softened it into memory. And behind him Dry Creek began to breathe again, not loudly, not all at once, but in small, uneven motions, a chair scraping against wood, a boot shifting, a quiet cough that felt louder than it should have. And yet no one stepped forward to fill the space that had been left behind, because that space was no longer empty. It held something heavier now, something that did not belong to any one person but rested on all of them equally. And Miss Laurel turned slowly, her hands still trembling just enough to be seen if someone was looking closely. And she moved back toward her shop without a word, carrying with her the memory of every stitch she had made, now tied to something far greater than the simple work of her hands. And Sheriff Haver stood near the post for a moment longer, his gaze lowered to the loosened chain that hung without purpose, swaying slightly in the light breeze. And there was a time when that sight would have meant control, order, a problem contained and handled. But now it looked different, incomplete, as if the chain itself understood that it had been used for something it was never meant to hold. And he reached out as if to steady it, then stopped, his hand hovering for a second before dropping back to his side, because touching it would not restore what had already been undone. And across the square a few men removed their hats, not in ceremony, not in instruction, just quietly, as if something in them recognized the need to do so, even if they could not fully explain why. And Elias finally exhaled, a slow breath he had not realized he had been holding, and he turned away from the road, his boots pressing into the same dust that now felt different beneath him, less certain, more honest. And he took a step, then another, not toward the sheriff, not toward the crowd, but toward the empty space where Takoda had stood. And he paused there, looking down at the ground, at the faint marks left by boots and chains and shifting weight. And for a moment he imagined the story as it had been told only an hour ago, simple, clean, wrong. And then he let that version fade, because it no longer held anything worth keeping, and the wind moved again, gentler now, carrying with it not the sharp scent of smoke, but something lighter, something that spoke of distance and open land. Beyond the town, and somewhere out past the bend, where the road stretched into something wider than Dry Creek could contain, Dakota and the boy continued walking, not fast, not slow, just steady, and though no one in the square could see them anymore, their absence was felt more clearly than their presence had been, because absence has a way of revealing what was never fully understood, and back in the square, life began to return in cautious steps, voices low, movements deliberate, as if each person had to relearn how to stand in a place that had just shifted beneath them, and no one spoke of what had happened in any direct way. No one named it or explained it, because naming it would make it smaller than it was. And this was not something meant to be reduced. It was something meant to remain, quiet and steady, like a mark left not on the ground, but somewhere deeper, where it would not fade with time or distance. And Elias lifted his head once more, looking toward the horizon where the sky met the land in a thin, endless line, and for the first time that day, there was no weight pressing against his chest, only a quiet understanding that some fires do not need to be seen to change everything, and some truths do not need to be spoken to be heard. By late afternoon, Dry Creek had almost convinced itself that the morning had been a passing storm, something that came through fast and left without asking permission, something that did not need to be spoken of again, and yet the silence that followed did not feel like forgetting. It felt like holding something too heavy to set down, and Elias Carter felt it most as he walked the length of the street, past the saloon where laughter tried to return but never quite reached its old volume, past the general store where Miss Laurel stood behind her counter with thread still looped between her fingers, tying and untying a knot that no longer needed fixing, her eyes drifting now and then toward the road, as if expecting something she could not name, and further down, near the well, a group of men spoke in low tones, their voices carrying fragments of the same question shaped in different ways, not asking who Dakota was, but what they had chosen not to see, and that difference settled deeper than any answer could, and Sheriff Haver remained near the office doorway, hat low, posture steady but no longer rigid, as if the weight of command had shifted into something quieter, something that did not rely on being heard to be understood, and when Elias passed him, neither man spoke, but there was a brief moment where their eyes met, not in challenge, not in agreement, just an acknowledgement of a line that had been crossed without either of them stepping over it. And beyond the last building, where the road bent toward open land, the dust had finally settled, leaving behind faint tracks that would not last the night, and yet Elias knew they did not need to, because some paths remain long after they disappear from sight, and he paused there, looking out toward the horizon where the light had begun to soften, the sun lowering just enough to stretch shadows across the ground in long, quiet lines, and he imagined Dakota and the boy somewhere beyond that bend, still walking, not chased, not followed, just moving forward with the kind of certainty that does not need direction. And the thought did not bring relief. It brought something steadier, something that felt like truth settling into place. And back in town, small changes continued without announcement. A man who had laughed that morning now stood alone outside the saloon, hat in hand, staring at nothing in particular, as if trying to measure something that could not be seen. And Miss Laurel finally set her needle down, her hands stilling at last as she stepped outside and looked toward the same road, her expression no longer searching, just quiet. And near the post in the square, the chain had been removed without ceremony, coiled and set aside as if it had never held meaning at all, and the blackened wood beneath it stood alone now, no longer a place of judgment, just a piece of what remained after something had passed through, and the wind moved again, gentle, carrying with it the last faint trace of smoke that had once filled the air, now thinning, fading, leaving behind something clearer. And Elias turned away from the horizon and began to walk back through town, not with urgency, not with purpose that could be named, just with the understanding that what had happened would not leave with the day. It would stay, not in words, not in stories told over drinks, but in the quieter spaces where men think without speaking. And as the sun dipped lower, casting Dry Creek in a softer light, the The town did not return to what it had been. It became something else, something less certain, but more honest, and far beyond the bend in the road, where no one in town could see. Two figures continued forward into the open land, carrying nothing with them except what had already been proven, and leaving behind everything that no longer held. The night did not fall quickly over Dry Creek that day. It came slow, stretching shadows longer than usual, as if the sun itself was reluctant to leave what had changed behind, and the town moved through the evening with a quiet that felt earned rather than forced. Lanterns lit one by one along the street, their glow soft and steady, casting light that did not hide anything but revealed just enough to remind each person where they stood. And Elias Carter sat outside the small boarding house with his hat resting low in his hands, not drinking, not speaking, just listening to the sound of wind moving through the empty spaces between buildings. And for the first time in a long while, that sound did not feel lonely. It felt full, as if something unseen had settled into place and did not intend to leave. And across the street, Miss Laurel closed her shop later than usual, her movements slower, more deliberate, as if each action carried a meaning she had not noticed before. And when she stepped outside, she paused for a moment, looking toward the road once more, then up at the sky where the first stars had begun to show, faint but certain, and she let out a breath she had been holding since morning without realizing it. And further down the street, the men who had gathered earlier now sat in smaller groups, their voices low, not arguing, not defending, just speaking in a way that suggested they were no longer certain of what they once claimed to know. And Sheriff Haver remained near his office, but he had removed his badge, holding it loosely in his hand as if its weight had changed, not heavier, not lighter, just different, and he looked at it for a long moment before placing it on the table beside him, not as an act of resignation, but as a quiet acknowledgement that what it represented required more than what had been given that morning. And the post in the square stood alone under the dim light, its blackened surface no longer a symbol of anything, just wood that had endured something it had not chosen, and the chain that had once hung there lay coiled nearby, untouched, as if no one wished to claim it again. And the wind moved through the square, gentle now, carrying with it no trace of smoke, only the clean scent of open land beyond the town. And Elias lifted his head slightly, his eyes following that invisible path out past the bend, out into the distance where two figures had continued walking without looking back. And he understood then that what had happened was not something that ended when they left. It was something that began the moment the truth had been allowed to stand without being pushed aside. And he rose slowly, placing his hat back on his head, not with the same weight he had carried earlier, but with something steadier, something quieter, and he walked toward the edge of town once more, stopping where the dirt road stretched into darkness. And he stood there for a moment, not expecting to see anything, just acknowledging the space where the world opened wider than Dry Creek had ever allowed itself to believe. And somewhere out there, beyond sight, beyond sound, Dakota and the boy continued forward, their steps measured, not by distance, but by something far less tangible, something that could not be held or taken or denied. And as the night settled fully over the town, Dry Creek did not sleep the way it had before. It rested differently, not with certainty, but with awareness. And in that awareness, something new took root, quiet and unseen, waiting for the day it would be needed again. Morning came slower than usual, not because the sun hesitated, but because the town did, as if Dry Creek needed a little more time to decide what it would be when the light returned. And when it finally did, it revealed a place that looked the same in shape, but not in weight. The buildings unchanged, the dust still dry beneath boots, the well still creaking with the same tired rhythm. Yet something beneath it all had shifted, something that could not be seen, but could be felt in the way people moved, in the way voices stayed lower, in the way eyes lingered a second longer than before. And Elias Carter stepped out into that morning with the same quiet presence he carried the day before, but without the same tension in his shoulders, as if whatever had pressed against him had eased just enough to let him stand differently. And he walked past the square where the post still stood, its surface catching the early light in a way that made the charred wood look less like damage and more like memory. And no one had moved it, no one had replaced it, because some things are not meant to be erased, they are meant to remain where they are, silent and honest. And the chain that had been coiled nearby was gone now, not displayed, not hidden, simply removed from the place where it had once been used, and that absence spoke, louder than any explanation could have, and Miss Laurel opened her shop door with steady hands, the bell above it ringing softly as she stepped inside, and for a moment she paused at the threshold, looking back toward the road as she had the night before, but this time there was no searching in her eyes, only a quiet acceptance of distance, and Sheriff Haver emerged from his office shortly after, his badge returned to his chest, but worn differently, not as a shield against uncertainty, but as a reminder of it. And he did not look toward the square first as he usually did. He looked out toward the bend in the road, his gaze resting there for a moment before he turned back to his duties, and Elias noticed that, not with judgment, not with approval, just with the understanding that some changes do not need to be spoken to be real, and the town moved through the morning with a rhythm that felt familiar but carried a different tone beneath it, conversations starting and stopping with less certainty, gestures softer, laughter quieter, as if each person had learned something they were still trying to hold on to without fully knowing how, and out beyond the last building, where the land opened wide and the road stretched into distance. The wind carried no trace of smoke now, only the clean scent of open ground, and something else, something steady and enduring, and though no one in Dry Creek could see them, two figures continued along that road, their steps leaving marks that would fade by noon, but meant something far beyond the ground they touched, and Elias stood at the edge of town once more, his eyes following that invisible path not because he expected to find it, but because he understood that some directions are not meant to be seen, only followed in the way a man chooses to live after he has witnessed something that cannot be undone, and he turned then, not away from the road, but back toward the town, carrying with him a quiet resolve that did not announce itself, did not seek recognition, but settled into place like something that had been waiting for the right moment to exist. And as the sun rose higher over Dry Creek, the town did not return to what it had been before. It moved forward, not perfectly, not completely, but honestly. And in that honesty, something lasting began to take shape, something that would remain long after the memory of that morning softened into story, because some truths do not fade. They simply become part of the ground beneath every step that follows. By midday, the light over Dry Creek had turned sharp and honest, the kind of light that does not hide edges or soften truths, and people moved through it with a quiet awareness that had not been there days before, as if every step carried the memory of something they had almost missed, and Elias Carter found himself standing once more near the center of the square, not out of habit, not out of purpose, but because the place itself had changed and he needed to see it again in this new light. And the charred post stood where it always had, but it no longer drew attention the way it once did. It did not command the space. It simply existed within it, a piece of the town rather than the center of its judgment, and that shift was subtle but undeniable, because nothing had been removed, nothing had been rebuilt, yet everything felt altered, and Miss Laurel stepped out of her shop carrying a small bundle of cloth, her hands steady now, her movements deliberate, and she crossed the square without hesitation, stopping near the post where the ground still held faint impressions that would soon fade, and she knelt for a moment, not in ceremony, not in display, but in quiet intention, placing the cloth down gently, as if returning something that had been taken out of place, and no one asked her why. No one questioned the act, because the meaning did not need explanation. It settled into the space naturally, like something that had always belonged there, and Elias watched without interrupting, understanding that some gestures carry more truth than words ever could. And across the way Sheriff Haver stood with his hands resting loosely at his sides, not directing, not overseeing, simply present, his gaze moving from the post to the cloth to the people around him. And there was something different in the way he looked now, not authority diminished, but authority tempered, shaped by something he could not ignore, and the town itself seemed to follow that same quiet adjustment. Conversations held with more care, decisions made with a pause that had not existed before, as if each person had learned that certainty without understanding comes at a cost. And out beyond the edge of town the road stretched under the midday sun, empty to the eye but not to the mind, because those who had stood in the square that morning carried its memory with them in ways that did not fade with distance. And Elias felt it most clearly in the stillness between moments. In the space where action had once been immediate and unquestioned, now filled with thought, and he turned slowly, taking in the faces around him. Men and women who had not changed in appearance, but had shifted in something deeper, something quieter, something that would not announce itself, but would remain. And for a brief moment the wind moved through the square again, lifting dust in a soft spiral. That caught the light, and then settled back down. And in that motion Elias saw the shape of what had passed through Dry Creek. Not destruction, not conflict, but correction, something that had not demanded attention but had taken it all the same. And as the day continued, the town did not try to return to what it had been. It moved forward with that quiet weight, that steady awareness, and though no one spoke of the man who had walked away or the boy who had followed him, their absence remained present in every small change, in every pause before judgment, in every glance that lingered a second longer, and somewhere beyond sight, beyond the reach of the town's memory, Dakota and the boy continued their path, not looking back, not carrying what had been left behind, because what mattered had already been given, and it had taken root in a place that would never be the same again. By the time the sun began to lower again over Dry Creek, the town had settled into something quieter than peace and heavier than silence, a kind of understanding that did not ask to be spoken, but refused to be ignored. And Elias Carter stood once more at the edge of the square, not because he needed to, but because some places hold answers longer than others. And the charred post caught the evening light in a way that softened its edges without erasing what it had been, and the small cloth miss Laurel had placed earlier remained there, unmoved, its presence simple but undeniable, a marker not of what had happened, but of what had been seen too late, and people passed by it now without stopping, yet none of them looked away completely, each glance lingering just long enough to acknowledge something that no longer needed explanation. And Sheriff Haver walked across the square without calling attention to himself, his steps measured, his gaze steady, and when he reached the post he did not touch it, did not inspect it. He simply paused, just long enough for the moment to settle, then continued on, as if understanding that some things are not meant to be corrected by action, only carried forward by change. And Miss Laurel stood in her doorway watching the last of the daylight stretch across the road, her hands resting quietly at her sides, no longer searching, no longer unsettled, just present. And in that stillness there was no need to ask where Dakota had gone or whether he would return, because the answer no longer mattered in the way it once might have. And Elias lifted his eyes toward the horizon one final time, not expecting movement, not hoping for a sign, just acknowledging the space where something had passed through and left its mark without leaving anything behind. And the wind moved gently through the town, lifting dust in soft lines that caught the fading light and then settled again, as if the land itself had accepted what had happened and was ready to move forward, without needing to hold on to it. And in that quiet, as the sky shifted from gold to deepening blue, Dry Creek did not return to the place it had been before that morning. It stood in a different kind of balance, one built not on certainty, but on the willingness to pause, to look closer, to question what seemed easy. And that change did not come with applause or recognition. It came in small ways. In the way a man hesitated before speaking, in the way a woman listened a little longer, in the way a sheriff chose silence over command when silence held more truth, and far beyond the reach of the town, beyond the bend in the road and the limits of memory, Dakota and the boy walked under the same fading sky, their path unmarked by anything but the quiet certainty of steps taken without hesitation, and they did not look back, not because they needed to forget, but because there was nothing left behind that belonged to them anymore. And as night settled once more over Dry Creek, the town rested differently than it ever had, not with the weight of what had been done, but with the presence of what had been learned, and in that presence, something lasting remained, something that would not fade with time or distance, because out here, justice did not need a voice, it did not need a hand raised or a word spoken, it only needed a moment when truth was allowed to stand, and a man willing to see it.